current slide. Okay. I should say about last week's lecture, I did, I think, a few times refer to Kant's four moments in his account of the beautiful and of the sublime. They appear in both as movements. I've been working on the philosophy of music, and I suppose I had movements on the mind, but they are moments. It's not a grave error, but nonetheless worth pointing out. Today's lecture is on the arts. The picture here, perhaps I should stand out of the way, is the Swiss-born Austrian neoclassical painter Angelica Kaufmann's self-portrait of the artist hesitating between the arts of music and of painting. So that symbolizes the arts generally. Hopefully you'll remember, those of you who are here in the first lecture, that I defined aesthetics as the philosophy of beauty and the philosophy of the arts. And I raised a question, I've repeated this several times now, about why we should study these two things together. Because it seems there can be beautiful things that aren't art and works of art that aren't beautiful. I also touched upon the questions, what is beauty and what is art? We've looked now at the question, what is beauty, in some detail in lecture 2, and also we covered what is the sublime last week, which is another aesthetic category or concept distinct from beauty, at least in a narrow sense of beauty, although perhaps possible to assimilate to beauty in a broader sense. So today we're looking at the second of those two questions that I raised in the first lecture, what is art? So this is probably going to bleed into next week's lecture as well. In fact, it certainly will, I should think. What I want to do is begin by explaining two historical issues in answering or in asking the question, what is art? After that, I'll make some comments about philosophical definitions or philosophical responses to questions of the form, what is X? Socratic questions, as they're known. Then I'm going to describe 4 answers to the question, what is art? 4 accounts of art. These will be the ancient account, according to which art is a form of imitation or representation. The Greek word for this is mimesis, mu iota, mu eta, sigma iota, sigma. It's usually best to keep it untranslated, or at least it's often thought best, because it's perhaps not got any direct equivalent in English. And the second theory I'll talk about is the predominantly 19th century and early 20th century theory, according to which art is a kind of expression, usually an expression of emotion. The third kind of theory I'll talk about is what's known as an institutional theory, according to which art is defined in relation to an institution called the art world, made up of practitioners and critics and audiences and this kind of thing. And the fourth and final definition we'll look at is an aesthetic definition of art as artifacts which are supposed to produce aesthetic experiences or have aesthetic interest. Obviously, if the last definition were to turn out to be true, we'd have a pretty good answer to why we want to study the philosophy of art and the philosophy of beauty together. It would turn out that these two are conceptually related areas, something like that. If one of the other, the former definitions, turns out to be true, or theories turns out to be true, it might turn out that we're acting terribly irrationally and unreasonably in doing so. And then after that, I want to look at expression and representation, these ideas mentioned in the first two theories we'll look at in some more detail. So I'll get through about half of that today. I'm intending to get through about half of that today, and then half next week. Where's my... So the two pieces of historical background to the question, what is art? One of these I touched upon before in the first lecture, and this concerns the notion of the arts, or of the fine arts, which we have, or at least have some idea of today, that includes primarily painting, sculpture, architecture, music and poetry, and is often supplemented these days by things like dance, film, conceptual art as well. These kind of things we tend to keep distinct from what you might call the mechanical, productive, or decorative arts, things that would include carpentry, blacksmithing, tanning, perhaps interior design, if you do want to keep decorative arts distinct from the fine arts. Obviously, there's a good chance that some of these notions will be fuzzy, at least in our everyday use of them. So, as I mentioned in the first lecture, this notion of the arts as a unified area involving a specific group of activities, somehow exalted above many other everyday activities, including very noble ones such as carpentry. This is often dated to the 18th century. There's a famous essay called The Modern System of the Arts by Paul Oscar Cristella. First half came out in 1951, second half in 1952, I think, in which he makes this argument, or argues for this point, I should say. Cristella, identifies the historical genesis of the modern notion of the art in the works of the French philosopher Charles Bateau, his 1746, The Fine Arts Reduced to a Single Principle. I also mentioned that Cristella talks about how the Greek and Latin words for art, tekne and ars, do not seem to cover things like painting, poetry, sculpture, and so forth. Especially, they seem to mean something more general, like skill or craft, and therefore would apply to carpentry, blacksmithery, that kind of thing. And I gave some reasons to resist this. I suggested that, well, even if they didn't have a word which applied to what we think of the more exalted area of the fine arts, as we do in the term art in some of its uses, and fine art specifically, that doesn't entail that the Greeks, Romans, medievals, early moderns didn't feel that there was a distinction between these two areas. And I gave some quotations which seem to suggest that they might do. Certainly that attitude towards poetry is very obviously very different to their attitude to the manufacture of shoes, whatever. I'll add a sidetrack relating to that on Greek vase painting, because it's rather fun. So I forget each week how I do this. There we go. This is a Greek vase. It's in the Mannerist style, the Greek Mannerist style, not the later one, in the modern age. And this is the name vase of the Pan painter around 470 BC. In the study of Greek vases, Greek pottery, a name vase means a vase after which a painter is named, because we usually don't know the names of the people who painted these. So one is chosen, this depicts Pan, so it's called, he's called the Pan painter, and then you can identify other works by the same artist on the basis of style. Sir John Beazley, the great authority on this stuff in the 20th century, especially the first half, who was professor of classical archaeology and art here in Oxford, he attributes about 150 or perhaps more vases to this particular painter. It seems to me, or at least I've heard it occasionally suggested, and it seems relatively intuitive, that Greek vases might be the most plausible example of a case where we impose a modern notion of the arts as a very exalted, high area of activity, where the people of the time, the people producing these works, might not have felt the same way about it. So, unlike poetry and architecture and sculpture and that kind of thing, Greek writers more or less neglect pottery, vase painting in their work. And I think, you can see there's in some examples at least, you can see why we might not take it that seriously. This is a Gorgonion, it's rather an impressive or interesting painting, but perhaps not something you'd associate with a high exalted life, of sensitivity to emotions and all that kind of thing we do associate with the arts, supposedly. Nonetheless, modern scholars do tend to treat, or at least have an inclination to treat at times, Greek vase painting as we treat modern art. You know, they distinguish schools, for instance, the pioneer school, who were the first to bring in the red figure technique in place of the earlier and less detailed black figure technique around the beginning of the 5th century BC, I think. Of course, most of you will be familiar with Keats's poem, the Ode on a Grecian Urn. Greek poets tend not to write odes on their pots. There's at least some indication that for ancient Greeks these were practical items, decorative, yes, but not to be included alongside their tragedies, their sculpture, and so forth. On the other hand, there's a possible counterexample to that kind of interpretation, and it's often mentioned in introductory courses on Greek vases. This is the Reveller's vase by the pioneer school painter Euthymides. There it is. The reason why this vase is considered especially interesting isn't only because of the rather well carried out foreshortening in the central twisted figure on side B. This is side B, the other side is side A, I assume. But also because of the inscription which appears on the base of this vase. It's up there, hos oudepoter Euphronios. So Euphronios was another Greek vase painter, and this means literally as never Euphronius, or as Euphronius was never able to do, something along those lines. So it's often pointed out that you see in this inscription, presumably put there by the painter himself, a level of fame amongst vase painters, rivalry between them, and a kind of pride in their work, which we might associate more with our contemporary idea of the arts. And something this brings out, at least, this kind of example, is that it's not easy to make a distinction between a clear case of fine art, of exalted work, and a very fine, expressive, or poetic piece of decorative art or productive art. And so if the claim that the ancients didn't have an idea of art like our own requires us not to count this kind of thing as fine art, then it might end up relying on quite a fuzzy concept and not being such an interesting claim as we originally might have taken it to be. So that's all I'll say on the first bit of historical background behind this question. Some people think that the idea of the arts appeared in the 18th century. Some people, myself included, might resist that, but it's clear the concept has developed over the time. The question is how much and in what way. In any case, in the 18th century, you do start getting works dedicated to looking at what art is, like that of Charles Bateau. The second bit of historical background, which is worth knowing, relates to the 20th century and the incredible developments which take place in the arts at that time. So although we do, to some degree, and it's often felt that we do, still have something like this unified idea of the arts as involving primarily or centrally poetry, painting, sculpture, architecture, that kind of thing, that idea met with a very strong challenge right from the beginning of the 20th century in the works of artists themselves, amongst the avant-garde. So the classic example of this, which usually comes up in aesthetics courses, is the French-American artist Marcel Duchamp. There he is, with a pipe. Duchamp, in 1917, was on the board of what was called the American Society of Independent Artists. This was a society for avant-garde art, and it defended the need for an exhibition which would exhibit the work of artists of any school, and at which artists could be certain that their work would be exhibited, regardless of how avant-garde it might be. So works submitted to this exhibition were supposed to be put on display without any selection process being carried out by the board. So Duchamp submitted a work known as Fountain. And this work consisted of a urinal, which Duchamp is reported to have purchased from a hardware store, and signed with the initials R. Mutt. There's his paintmanship. So despite the intention of the Society for Independent Artists that any work would be displayed, the board members, reportedly unaware that Duchamp had produced and submitted this work, concluded that it wasn't a work of art, and they refused to display it. And Duchamp resigned his position from the society and spent most of the rest of his life playing chess. So it's sometimes commented with a sense of irony that although at that time even the Society for Independent Artists, which are very avant-garde themselves, weren't willing to count this as a work of art, Duchamp's Fountain, there was a survey carried out in 2004, I think, of contemporary artists and perhaps critics as well, about the most influential work of modern art. And Duchamp's Fountain came number one, just beating Picasso to the top position. Mind you, most influential is an ambiguous phrase. It might be a pretty obviously literally true fact that it was the most influential, since there are aesthetics essays everywhere which use it as an example. In any case, it illustrates this work, Fountain, one of the reasons why philosophers in the 20th century started to take particular interest in this question, what is art, or what counts as a work of art? Because you have lots of people denying that purported works of art by well-known and respected artists are works of art at all, and getting very annoyed and angry about these things being produced and put on display and funded with government money and this kind of thing. On the other hand, you have groups of intellectuals with interest in art, with qualifications and so forth, taking a great deal of pains to explain why this is art, and defending it and giving it a lot of time. And so you end up with a real question about, well, how could it be that we're so much in disagreement about what counts as being art and what doesn't? One way of dealing with this situation is to try and come up with a philosophical theory or answer to the question, what is art? And then perhaps you could use that to decide about these possibly marginal cases. Obviously, Duchamp's Fountain isn't the only one like this. Other later well-known examples include Warhol's Brillo boxes. I checked, I think these are his and not just Brillo boxes, but I apologize if they are, and I've been fraudulent. Another one is Damien Hirst's 1993 Mother and Child Divided. These are two cows, each bisected and then suspended in formaldehyde. So this is, it's certainly a pun. If a pun is a sufficient condition for being a joke, it's a joke, but is it art? Is it a work of art? I actually, the factory at which Hirst's works of art are made is in my hometown in Stroud, and a good friend of mine, my oldest friend, who actually now works in the covered market here in Oxford, he worked at the factory for a while and knew lots of these people who were dumping animal carcasses in formaldehyde. So he found that an interesting job. I think he's happier at the covered market, but you'd have to ask him. So that gives us some idea of why we want to find an answer to the question, what is art? Not that there aren't concerns about whether this is a good project, philosophically. So The third thing I wanted to talk about was this kind of question, Socratic questions as they're called. What is X? The reason they're called Socratic questions is because they're the kind of questions which are asked in what are known as the Socratic dialogues by Plato, the supposedly earlier dialogues in which Socrates asks the question, what is beauty, what is virtue, and so forth, and comes to no conclusion about it. Perhaps an initial reason to doubt whether this is a philosophically viable task. These come up all the time in philosophy, and of course all of the lectures I've given so far have been entitled with a Socratic question. What is aesthetics, what is beauty, what is the sublime, what is art? But it's not clear we have a methodology for answering them. All I'll say about this on this occasion is that one assumption, which is frequently made, is that when we're answering these questions, we're trying to give a definition. And the point about that, which should be kept in mind, is that there are different kinds of definitions and indeed different ways of dividing between different kinds of definition. One useful distinction, which I'll outline, is that between what's known as an extensional and an intentional definition. So an extensional definition of a term is given by listing all of the things which come within the extension of that term, or which fall under that term. For example, an extensional definition of Oxford permanent private halls would go Blackfriars, Campion, Regent's Park, St Stephen's House, St Benet's, Wycliffe. If you're asked what is a permanent private hall, you can be given that list and you've been given every example. So extensional definitions, well, they have the virtue that they can be used to decide otherwise controversial cases. All you have to do is look on your list, and if it's on there, it's one of the things, and if it isn't, it isn't. They have two major disadvantages. The first disadvantage is that they could end up being very long indeed. Imagine trying to list every work of art. The other disadvantage is that even once we've got our list, or if someone else presents us with a list, we haven't been given any information on why the things on the list are being grouped together. So if all we have is an extensional definition, we might still wonder whether we're not arbitrarily grouping a bunch of things together which shouldn't go together in the first place. It's that latter problem which I think concerns us most in the case of answering the question, what is art? Primarily because although you couldn't answer this question without wasting an awful lot of time by trying to list every work of art, you might try to answer it by appealing to the supposedly 18th century system of the arts. You could say, well, a work of art is a work of architecture or painting or poetry or music, etc. You might want to supplement your list with film, dance, conceptual art, carcasses suspended in formaldehyde. I suppose that might count as sculpture. So we could do that, but unless we had some kind of system for deciding what goes on the list and what doesn't, we'd presumably be putting them on or leaving them off arbitrarily. I mean, our system might be merely to follow our intuitions in either case. I suppose we could do that, and that mightn't be such a bad idea. But in any case, you might think that it would be much better, it would be preferable to have an intentional definition. The second type of definition, which I've mentioned. An intentional definition doesn't list all the things which fall under a term. Rather, it gives you necessary and sufficient conditions for something to fall under a term. For instance, an intentional definition of a triangle might be a closed plane figure having three vertices being corners. Now, an intentional definition like that gives us a way of deciding controversial cases. If there's a controversial example of a triangle, we can say, well, is it a closed plane figure? Does it have three corners? and decide whether it counts as a triangle or not according to that. But it also has the advantage, or seems to have the advantage, of telling us why a group of things go together. It tells us the thing they all have in virtue of which they come under a term. It's worth noting that it's not entirely clear that all intentional definitions do this. You might define a triangle in terms of having 3 sides rather than 3 corners, and it might be suggested that the essence of a triangle is 3 corners and 3 sides is just a necessary accident or something along those lines. But leaving that to one side, at least we get some idea of why things go together in the case of intentional definitions. And for that reason, philosophers, from Plato, in my opinion, have tended to prefer these kinds of definitions. One last thing worth saying about intentional definitions is that it is worth avoiding circularity. Perfectly acceptable in some respects, intentional definition of a triangle would be anything that is not a triangle. But whilst that tells us something true of all triangles and only triangles, it's a necessary and sufficient condition of being a triangle, it doesn't tell us much. Obviously, it's a trivial definition. So we'd want to avoid that kind of thing. Obviously, then, it seems plausible, at least, that in answering the question, what is art, we'd like to have an intentional definition of art, which will just say, well, a work of art is an artifact with X, Y, and Z properties. Anything else isn't a work of art. And that would close the discussion. But also, you might think, well, if we don't get that, getting some necessary conditions or some sufficient conditions might be useful. And depending on how we feel about the way language works and the way philosophy works, you might think that actually intentional definitions are too high a bar to set and we'll never be able to get something like that. Even Plato himself raises a paradox about this, Meno's paradox, in the dialogue called the Meno. Meno asks Socrates, well, how are you going to define virtue, or say what virtue is, unless you already know what it is? Because if you don't know what it is, then even when you come across the correct definition, you won't be able to recognize it as the correct definition. Whereas if you already know what it is, then there's no point in us asking this question. Okay, that'll do for methodological stuff. I'll turn now to the 2 historical answers. The reason these are historical answers, the first I'm going to look at, is that they're not 20th century. I suppose the 20th century is also historical, and one of them does have influence in the 20th century. But anyway, they're the older ones. So these are the accounts of art in terms of mimesis, or imitation, representation, and an account of expression, respectively. I'll start with the former. I'm just making sure I haven't missed out a picture. I didn't really want to have this one on here so long. Anyway, there's another coming soon. I'm sorry if it's worrying any of you. So, mimesis. This is a Greek word. I said it means something like imitation, and I said that it's often left untranslated because it doesn't mean precisely imitation. That's a difficult question. I tend to feel, if you look at a Greek philosophical dialogue and mimesis is translated imitation in all of its instances, it's almost always perfectly comprehensible and you can get an idea of what they mean by that. So I think it's quite a good translation. But it might beg some philosophical questions, in particular whether expression is also a kind of mimesis, which I'll bring up later or perhaps next week. Other translations include representation or mimicry. And in the work of Plato and Aristotle and their followers, you get some idea, or quite a strong idea, I think, of an account of art, if not being argued for and offered, at least being presupposed in terms of mimesis, and in particular an account of art including primarily what we consider the fine arts. So you might get a precursor to the modern system here. So in any case, it's very frequently said that the mimesis, the representational or imitative theory of art, is the theory of art of the classical period, and also right up until the 18th century. This is a statue of Aphrodite, the Cnidian Aphrodite, by the great Greek sculptor Praxiteles, I think. This is a good example of imitation because, according to some sources at least, this was such a successful imitation of the human form that young men would fall in love with the statue and subsequently be disappointed by the fact that it's made of, well, this one's made of marble because it's a Roman copy. So I'll start by outlining Plato. So Plato's canonical work on art as imitation appears in the Republic, and pretty much entirely in books 2 and book 10. There's some question as to whether he has the same theory in both of these books, or whether he changes it, or he's just somehow inconsistent in his account. Perhaps he's even using the word mimesis in a different way. It's not clear that there are any determinate answers to these questions, at least determined by the content of the text. So I'll go through both of the accounts in book 2 and in book 10. So in book 2, from 377 onwards, Socrates and the other characters in the dialogue are discussing what stories would be allowed in a perfect city. As presumably many or all of you know, the Republic is a long dialogue deciding what the perfect city would be like in order to find out ultimately what justice consists in. So part of working out what a perfect city would be like is working out what stories you would have in a perfect city and what works of art. And from 392c on, Socrates identifies a form of mimesis in poetry. Importantly here, at least the Plato scholarship, is that he doesn't say at this stage that poetry is just a kind of mimesis, just a kind of imitation. Rather, he picks out the cases where a poet, Homer, he's talking about in particular in this instance, uses direct speech. So some of Homer is in narrative form. Some is narrative insofar as it's narrated by a character within the dialogue, but at length. But other parts, you get the character themselves presenting their views or feelings about something. You know, you get Achilles castigating Agamemnon, saying, well, I don't know what he says. He says, "You're a complete rotter, Agamemnon. Give me my plunder back." Now, Plato raises a worry about this kind of thing. He says, well, first he says, this can be distinguished. This is mimetic. It's imitative poetry. And he says, there's a worry because people are going to read this out and perform these works. Greek poetry, Greek epic poetry, having been performed primarily, presumably because it developed in a society which wasn't literate and was passed on as a tradition to a society which, to some unknown but relatively high degree was. People are going to perform this poetry, and they're going to stand there taking on the character, perhaps of some unvirtuous people, some low people, or even some virtuous people like Achilles, who are nonetheless willing to castigate their king, which is not very appropriate, so Plato thinks, and perhaps they'll take on part of this character, its qualities. It seems to Plato a dangerous thing, or to Socrates of the dialogue, a dangerous thing for people to be doing. This is echoed, of course, in a long tradition historically of suspicion about the ethical acceptability of performance and drama. There's some very interesting recent work on this by Zaki Zamira of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, suggesting that although we've more or less given up on this idea today that there's something morally worrying about acting, perhaps we oughtn't to have done so. Perhaps this is a difficult area of human activity. Socrates continues, very interestingly, to identify different musical modes also as imitating the actions of different kinds of person. And Socrates and Adimantus conclude that only the Dorian and Phrygian modes ought to be admitted in the perfect city, because these ones imitate the courageous person active in battle, or the free citizen acting in moderation, and all others of these 7 or 8 kinds of music should be gotten rid of. Socrates adds at this stage painting, architecture, embroidery, and other forms of creating, or demiurgia. And it seems, perhaps even at this early stage in Book 2, that Plato is already getting rid of the idea that only some kinds of poetry, only poetry with direct speech, are mimesis or imitation, and is starting to stretch this out to a theory of art in general. So, in Book 10, the discussion of mimesis resumes. And importantly here, Plato argues that painters imitate in their painting perceptible objects. And of course, for Plato, perceptible objects, chairs and things, are mere shadows or instantiations of the form of the chair and so forth. And for this reason, very famously, Plato claims that paintings and such things are twice removed from reality. They are mere imitations of appearances. And he associates this in a slightly hazy general way with their being morally deleterious. Partly he draws on discussion in books 3 through 9 to suggest that these will appeal to the lower part of the human soul because their appearance and not reality, the higher part of the rational faculties are interested in reality, the intelligible world, rather than mere appearances. And it's it's of quite a great deal of interest here that Plato, in this discussion, seems to make a distinction very similar to the modern distinction between the fine arts and the practical or mechanical arts. This is a 596b onwards. Plato says that a carpenter making a chair or table does so with his eyes towards the form of these things, and therefore is not engaged in the objectionable imitation or mimesis of mere appearances. But painting and poetry involve creating something with one's eye to a mere appearance, and so these are a different kind of activity. This lines up pretty well with the kind of distinction between the fine and productive arts which you see in the modern age in Charles Bateau's work and elsewhere. Paul Oscar Cristella himself resists assimilating Plato's distinction between mimetic and productive arts to our modern one. He does so on the grounds that Plato's distinction doesn't have anything to do with works of art being fine. He says, since Plato, imitation is a basic metaphysical concept which he uses to describe the relation between things and ideas. I'm not quite sure what Cristella means there. Presumably it's something like, for Plato, an imitative work needn't be beautiful, it needn't be fine. So it's a different idea. Mind you, for us, a work of fine art needn't be beautiful or fine. This is one of the problems with our understanding of art, and so perhaps that's not such a good reason to suppose this isn't a precursor to our own system. Aristotle, in the Poetics, also develops an idea of art as mimesis, as imitation. I've got a rather lengthy quotation, but it's very it expresses in one go the main points of Aristotle's view on this, I suppose. He says epic poetry, then, and the poetry of tragic drama, and, moreover, comedy and dithyrambic poetry, and most flute playing and harp playing, these, speaking generally, may all be said to be representations, or mimesis, pasai tuncanusin husai mimesis ton sun olon. But they differ from one another in 3 ways, either in using means generically different or in representing different objects, or in representing objects not in the same way but in a different manner. And so he talks about the use of both colour and form to represent things in painting and sculpture, representing things with a human voice, and then he says, so it is also with the arts, with the technies, which we have mentioned. They all make their representations, their mimesin, in rhythm and language and tune, using these means either separately or in combination. And he goes along to echo Plato's idea that rhythms and tunes in music can represent or imitate the characters of persons in character and experiences and in actions. So that's quite similar to much of what Plato says. Aristotle, of course, goes on in the Poetics to talk mainly about tragic drama and doesn't come back to these other kinds of art. It's widely held that he had another section which dealt with comedy, which we no longer have. It's occasionally been claimed that there would have then been a section on painting or on visual art. This isn't, as far as I'm aware, widely accepted. Christella denies it. He says this must be rejected, but I don't think he gives a reason. So anyway, I'm sure there are some reasons. So after Plato and Aristotle, the notion of mimesis, which previously hadn't really been very important in Greek thought, as far as I'm aware, it appears in some Aristophanes' plays, usually as a derogatory description of dramatic art, of tragedy, but otherwise isn't important in Greek discussion of art. It becomes pretty canonical afterwards, and you see it appearing in later ancient authors and in authors right up through to the modern age. I have an example from Hamlet. In scene 2, the protagonist says that the purpose of playing, both at the first and now, was and is to hold as 'twere the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her own feature, scorn her own image, and the very age and body of the time his form and pleasure. So Shakespeare seems to endorse there a mimetic theory of art as well, or at least of drama, playing. It is important to draw a distinction. One of the final points I'll make on mimesis is to draw a distinction between imitation in this context and deception. This is a point that Schelling is reported to have talked about at one point. So we can imitate not in order to produce a work of art, but in order to deceive people, of course, as in, when you pretend to be happy when you're actually miserable, or you pretend to be interested in the subject matter of your lecture when you're actually bored. And there's an exception, of course, which is the Trompe-l'oeil painting. I have an example of one of these. These are quite fun. That's it's not very good quality. This is painted on the street. It's the Dies Irae. These are people sort of falling into a horrible ditch and so forth. It's painted to look like it's really there, despite the fact that it isn't actually there. So that is obviously a marginal case of a work of art which does imitate an image for the purpose of deceiving or doing something that looks like deception. Usually, though, that would be a marginal case. One thing this brings out about the mimesis account is we can't be getting here an intentional definition as I defined it, because an intentional definition has to give us necessary and sufficient conditions for being a work of art. But since there can be instances of imitation which are not works of art, where it's purely for deception, it's not a Trompe-l'oeil, or Louis, I think, this could be at most a necessary condition and not a sufficient condition. I'd also like to spend some time casting some doubt on how seriously Plato means to reject poetry in the Republic, but if I do that, I won't say anything about expression, so I shan't. So I'll conclude by outlining quite briefly in the last 6 minutes the expression theory of art. Now, the imitation one, as I said, goes back to Plato and Aristotle. You could argue that the association of art with expression, and in particular with expression of emotion, might go back that far as well, depending especially on how you interpret Plato and Aristotle's comments about music. On some theories of expression, what they say would be interpretable as music expresses character, something like that. But it doesn't really arise as a central idea in philosophical theories of the arts until the 19th century. And it first appears towards the beginning of that century in the writings of poets and critics talking about poetry in particular. It's rather interesting that this second important historical account of the arts, like the mimetic account, starts out as an account of poetry and then gets extended to other areas. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's not interesting, but, well, it might be a coincidence. Who knows? The most famous statement of the expression-based account of the arts in relation to poetry in particular is probably Wordsworth's. His 1800/1802 preface to Lyrical Ballads includes the claim that all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. That's Wordsworth looking full of powerful feelings, just ready to overflow. Actually, it's not, it's an imitation of Wordsworth. Subsequent examples amongst poets and critics abound. William Hazlitt says in his 1818 on poetry in general that poetry is the language of the imagination and the passions. Later, Thomas Hardy writes that poetry is emotion put into measure. A similar view is expressed by A. Houseman in 1933 in his lecture, The Name and Nature of Poetry, where he says, to transfuse emotion, not to transmit thought, but to set up in the reader's sense a vibration corresponding to what was felt by the writer, is the peculiar function of poetry. We don't get a philosophical account of the arts in terms of expression, however, until the the late 19th century. I think since it's within a few minutes of 4, what I'll do is conclude there for today and begin next week's lecture by going through the philosophical accounts of art in terms of expression. These are given by the novelist Leo Tolstoy, who was also philosopher, published a very important book entitled What is Art in 1897. And then the Neapolitan philosopher Benedetto Croce, and the British philosopher Collingwood. Having done that, I'll go on next week and talk about the other two theories of art we're going to look at as well, and then perhaps get on to looking a bit more closely at what representation is and what expression is, and whether once all these theories of art have completely failed, that can nonetheless give us some insight into what art is doing. So that'll do for now.